students need space to make mistakes and figure it out, but then support to navigate that.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to People, Parasites, and Plagues, a podcast aimed at delivering information about the fascinating pathogens among us from the scientists who study them. I am Kim Klanowski.
And I am David Peterson, your host for today's episode. One of the most important skills a research scientist can have is the ability to effectively mentor students in their lab. But that brings up several questions. What's the best way to teach mentoring, and who mentors the mentors? Our guest today studies these and other questions related to effective mentoring.
Our guest today is Dr. Erin Dolan, professor in the Department of Biochemistry and Molecular Biology, Meg's Distinguished Teaching Professor, and Georgia Athletic Association Professor of Innovative Science Education. Erin, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks. I'm happy to be here.
So, Erin, one thing that we like to ask our guests is, how did you get to science? What was your pathway?
Oh, that's such a great question to set the stage. So I was always interested in living things. And in fact, my mother was horrified when I would catch a snake in the yard and put it in a bathtub. But I knew I didn't want to be a doctor or a veterinarian because both animals and people bleed and vomit, and that was not my thing. So when I went to college, I majored in biology and was just really interested in what the faculty were doing and thought I wanted to be a professor in a small college. So that's actually how I got started. And obviously I didn't end up at a small college.
But you did go to graduate school and do what some would consider traditional bench research at some point.
That's absolutely true. So because I wanted to be a professor at a small college, I started doing undergraduate research as a student, and realized that, okay, I need a PhD to be a professor at a small college. So I ended up going to grad school and earning a PhD in neuroscience at the University of California at San Francisco, which is actually a medical school. So some people don't know that you can earn a PhD at a medical school, and that means that you don't really gain any teaching experience because there aren't undergraduates to teach. But to be competitive for jobs at small colleges, you need teaching experience. So I started volunteering in the San Francisco Unified School District through a partnership the university had with the school district, and I loved working with teachers. They were thinking not just about how do I learn the science or how do I understand myself or how do I do well on a test, but how do I learn the science in a way that helps me explain it to someone else, help someone else understand it. And I was hooked. So that's where I actually transitioned from doing bench science to studying science education.
So, Erin, if you can distill it on down, what is the fundamental question or questions that drives your current research?
Absolutely. So what is super interesting to me is how research training environments influence whether students decide to continue in a research career. And I'm interested in the environment rather than the things that the student knows or their skills that they can employ, because what we know from lots of research on students' career decision-making is that you can have the knowledge, skills, and abilities to be successful in research or successful in science and still choose not to pursue that. And in fact, some really talented students opt out of research careers because of factors in the environment, like mentoring, like the nature of the research they do, like the nature of the interactions they have in the lab or in the field. And so I'm really interested in what we call the psychological and social factors in the research training environment. For example, how a student sees themselves, their confidence in their ability to be successful, and how their interactions with other people, including mentors in the lab, influence whether they choose to go on in research careers.
So I believe your research has shown that mentoring success is not linked to a demographic match between a mentor and a mentee.
That's correct.
But something that you define as psychological similarity.
That's right. And actually, I'm building on a lot of research by other folks who studied mentoring in youth contexts, in workplace settings, and in academia. And this is actually the work of postdoctoral researcher Trevor Tuma, which he actually started when he was a PhD student. And what we wanted to get at was this idea that everyone has, that you have to match demographically with your mentor to have an effective mentoring relationship. So those would be things like a woman feeling like a woman will be a more effective mentor, or a Black student feeling like a Black faculty member will be a more effective mentor. And what we found actually is that psychological similarity or the idea that you share interests, beliefs, values, and attitudes is actually more predictive of effective mentoring relationships than demographic match. And in fact, demographic match, it turns out, really has no effect on whether you're able to develop a high-quality relationship or a relationship that's effective for the mentee.
So should mentors be actively looking for that match?
That's a great question. And in fact, the community has really searched for what value that match has. For example, what we didn't study is the influence of a mentor as a role model. So, for example, you might need some examples of people who look like you and seem like you in the field to feel like you have a place in that field. But that's really different than mentoring, which involves a sustained interpersonal relationship over time and provides both career support and what's called psychosocial support, so encouragement, normalizing the struggle of succeeding in the field, really a sense of friendliness and warmth that lead to positive outcomes for a mentee that are different from, for example, the effect of a role model. And what we see is that effective mentoring can come from lots of different places. And in fact, at least some research in the field suggests that folks who are in positions of power, so in STEM disciplines, that might be white men, have access to resources that maybe folks who aren't in those positions don't have, and they can share those resources as mentors and therefore actually be quite supportive and effective mentors.
And that might sometimes not be direct mentoring either. That might be mentoring from other faculty members that maybe aren't your primary mentor, right? So like career mentors and different things also might fall into that category.
Absolutely. And in fact, I encourage mentees to really think about their constellation of needs and assume that no single person can help meet all those needs. So students can be really intentional about thinking, all right, who can provide me emotional support? Maybe that's not a thing I get in the workplace or in my research training, but I get it from my family and my friends. And then how do I get career support? So maybe a faculty member can help you with your career aspirations, but maybe not. I also try to encourage folks to think about how to leverage your mentor's networks. So for example, I may not have experience in industry, but I have former postdocs who've gone into industry, and I can connect my mentees to those individuals so that they can learn about those career paths and get support in pursuing them.
So our current system of matching incoming new grad students with their mentors basically is a short rotation in the mentor's lab, which could be just 6 weeks or so. And the mentor and mentee kind of assess the match some ill-defined way. What kind of guidance could we give both mentor and mentee to kind of improve this process?
That's a great question. So Trevor's research actually showed that rotations versus direct admission, so when a student, for example, meets a faculty member at a conference or reaches out to them by email, maybe arranges a Zoom meeting, and then decides to join that graduate program strictly to work with that individual, makes no difference.
Oh, I am surprised.
I know. We were surprised too. We assumed that rotations would give people a chance to really get to know each other better, get a sense of the research group culture, and make a more informed decision. But what Trevor's research actually indicates is not only does the rotation versus direct admission not affect the quality of the relationship that eventually develops or the mentoring support that the mentor provides to the mentee, but that really students have sort of a honeymoon period in the lab. And so it's not actually super useful to rely just on the impressions that you might make in the first 4 to 6 weeks in the lab, but instead to actually ask people who've been in the research group for a while and get a real sense of what that research group is like, how it operates, how the mentor is, what kinds of support they provide. Are they more hands-on, hands-off? And that's not to say that any single behavior on the mentor's behalf is the right or wrong behavior, but rather, how do you find something that's a match for you as a mentee? So really asking other people in the group, including people who've maybe left the group or graduated recently, to give their perspective on how the lab culture operates and how the mentor provides support, and then make a judgment based on that. And really to trust your judgment. If you hear things are not great, that's a flag. Even if you really, really love the science, trust that people are telling you things are not great.
So you bring up a lot of good points, especially about doing your research before you go to a lab. And I think many students do that and have the opportunity to do so because, there's websites and things where you can find alumni information. But say you have a scenario where a student blindly, or maybe doesn't do their research, I should say, goes to a lab. And they really like the lab and they really like the research, but the mentor relationship maybe isn't the best. Should mentors modify their mentoring style for individual students?
So first of all, mentoring is really a bidirectional relationship. And so no single way of mentoring is going to be effective for everyone. So absolutely, mentors need to work with each individual and figure out what's going to be helpful for them by listening to them, asking them, and responding. So it's really a relationship that develops over time. And so that means that you might provide certain support early on and different support later on as the mentee gains expertise and independence. And so it's really responsive over time. That said, there's things that I do as a mentor that I feel comfortable doing as a mentor, and there's things that I won't do. And so knowing what your boundaries are as a mentor and communicating those clearly before someone joins the research group, I think is quite helpful. The challenge is it requires you to be pretty reflective as a faculty member, and we don't often get a lot of practice being reflective about really what kinds of support can we provide and what kinds of support are we really not in a good position to provide.
Well, and you also you talked about the honeymoon period, but you also have that awkward period in the beginning, too, when people come into the lab. And that's when you're really supposed to be having these important conversations. But it's also awkward because you're still getting to know each other as well.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So the longer you know someone, at least certain folks, depending on how they relate to people they work with, are more willing to disclose information. And if you disclose things that obviously you're comfortable disclosing, the more that relationship can be responsive to what you've disclosed, the more you can build a sense of trust and bidirectional communication.
So your research spans quite a range of disciplines, and you have ongoing collaborations with folks in psychology, behavioral psychology, other things. And you were trained as a bench science, so did you naturally just fit in with these? Was it a struggle to integrate these into your research?
Super interesting question. So I'm a neuroscientist, so that means I know about the brain, which helps. Yeah, that helps. I know about learning and memory. I know about behavior. I also would say that I'm probably a pretty reflexive person, so I pay a lot of attention to social interactions. And one of the things that was most striking to me and got me interested in studying research training was that back in the day, I did undergraduate research, but my research mentor as an undergraduate actually was on sabbatical in Australia. And this is a time when there was not really internet. For listeners who may not be aware that existed that time, I remember sending my first email, like the cursor prompt, like Pine Mail back in the day in college. And so it really wasn't easy to interact with them, to get support. And so I didn't really get what I was doing. And it wasn't until about my third year of grad school where I had to write my qualifying exam. And the focus was on discovering new knowledge that I realized, oh, wait a second, that's the point. That's what I'm doing. I'm not just supposed to recapitulate what we already know, which is what I had done in all of my undergraduate lab classes. And so I guess that kind of self-awareness and awareness of how interactions with others or a lack of interactions with others afforded or constrained the way I was thinking about research training is what sort of allowed me to do that transition. I'll also add that I actually actively sought mentorship. So, for example, Lillian Eby is a distinguished professor here at University of Georgia who is an organizational psychologist and a premier scholar in the mentoring space, among other accomplishments. And so I cold emailed her. And she was kind enough to respond, and we collaborated on an interdisciplinary proposal to the National Science Foundation, which is how I really kind of trained up to study mentoring, is by working with a mentor who could help me advance my own knowledge and skills and make a contribution myself.
And was that as a graduate student or postdoc or new faculty?
I was a faculty member. I was a faculty member, and this was a special funding mechanism for folks who'd been trained as bench folks or disciplinary scientists who were transitioning into studying, teaching, and learning in the discipline.
How interesting.
Yeah.
I should point out that in the time I've been at UGA, which has been a few decades now, I can't remember arriving here of seeing anyone in a science department who studied education, science education. And then it started kind of popping up in different, cell bio hires someone, genetics does, biochemistry does. I think it's fantastic because maybe I shouldn't let out the secret, but most faculty are not trained in effective teaching or mentoring. It's far too often something on the job that is on the job training. So,
well, David, that was great because you led me into the next question, which is your research, of course, has given you a lot of insight on good mentoring, and that has allowed you to develop some workshops to introduce some important mentoring skills to new faculty and maybe also just other faculty who want to become better mentors. Have you considered the flip side, also helping new students best align with a complementary mentor?
Absolutely. And in fact, I had the privilege of helping develop curriculum for the Grad First program. For folks who aren't familiar, this is sort of our onboarding seminar course for new graduate students. And I find that the sort of thinking about mentoring up, helping them identify who might be a good mentor, how to develop their mentoring network, how to really develop relationships that help them get the support they need is an integral part of that experience. So we do a lot of work with grad students and also with faculty. The advantage of working with faculty is that they mentor lots of people, right? Whereas a grad student, presumably, they're developing one or just a few relationships.
So you have a lot of different projects, a lot of irons in the fire, but one I found particularly interesting was the project that focuses on career trajectory of undergraduates in the sciences and what course-based research can do to affect that trajectory. So could you tell us a bit about that?
Of course. This speaks to the point I made earlier about having research experience as an undergraduate and not really getting what it was about. It turns out that only about half the folks in the U.S. go to college, and only 20 to 25% major in a science degree or a STEM degree. And then of those, just a small fraction actually get an opportunity to participate in research. So that's a problem, right? Because research is how we generate new knowledge in science. It's really what we as scientists practice. That's what we do. So for students to have a chance to try what scientists actually do really limits the kinds of careers they can consider. So course-based undergraduate research is a way of integrating a research project into a class that students would normally take. So this could be, for example, their introductory biology lab class. It could be their general chemistry lab class. It could maybe be a sophomore level microbiology class where students address a research question or problem that matters outside the classroom. So it has a potential to make a difference either in the scientific community or for the general public or the campus community. And the cool thing about this is that we did a study where we examined the effects of a 2-semester course-based undergraduate research experience or CURE experience taken during the first and second year of college, which is often when students leave a STEM discipline because they're turned off, to be frank, or they haven't had sufficient preparation to be successful in those courses. And what we found is that 2-semester experience actually substantially improved retention in college. So it improved graduation rates at the institution we were studying from about 60% to 75%, which is huge. And of those who stayed in college, it increased their retention in STEM majors from about 70% to 95%. So that's a huge effect.
That's really significant.
Mm-hmm. So I think these courses are great. So understanding that this course-based research is happening, I think, is great, and especially for smaller colleges that don't have a real strong research community for students to kind of go in and do what we again consider the more traditional lab experience. They're still getting research experience. So to go back to your kind of main question where you were looking at persistence in science, how do you measure the persistence in science or the success in a science career? Because I'd like to kind of talk to the type of research you do, really. How do you analyze recordings, for example? How do you just analyze qualitative data?
Yeah, like what does a data even look like?
Yes.
Absolutely. So we use a lot of different data types, and we try to match the type of data to the kinds of things we want to understand. For example, For that persistent study where we were looking at retention in STEM majors or graduation from college, we actually just looked to see, are you enrolled in the major? Did you finish college? And we also used a procedure called propensity score matching, which involves careful matching on lots of different variables. For example, the number of high school math and science courses you take influences your likelihood of staying in a STEM major and finishing college. So we had to control for that. Your gender affects your likelihood of staying in a STEM major and graduating from college. So we had to control for that. So we use a lot of statistical models to look at those kinds of effects, but then we also need to develop hypotheses, right, or working models about how students are experiencing research training environments. And I'll just point out the research of a former postdoc, Marielle Pfeiffer, who's now a faculty member at University of Mississippi. She did a super interesting study to try and understand other factors in the research training environment that influenced whether early career researchers actually saw themselves as researchers. And I'll explain a little bit about this. Lots of work has been done on what's called science identity. So whether a student sees themselves as a science person. And that's really quite important for predicting whether they're likely to stay in science. But most of that work has been done with high school students or early undergraduate students, often with students who are trying to make a decision. Do I want to stay in a science major or not? What hasn't been done is more of a look at researcher identity. So how do I decide if I'm a science person, what kind of science person I want to be? Do I want to be a science researcher or do I want to do something else? For example, do I want to go on to a career in healthcare? And so Marielle collected data from a national sample of early career researchers, so undergraduates, post-baccalaureate researchers, so those are students who finished their undergraduate degree but haven't decided to go into graduate school yet, and then grad students to ask them about, do they think of themselves as researchers or not, and what is it that makes them think of themselves as researchers or not? And what we learned from that research is that things like whether the students get to make decisions about their research versus being told what to do, or decide how to go about their research, again, versus being told what to do, or shaping the direction of their research. For example, bringing their own brain to the problem and saying, hey, listen, I think we should do this for this reason. All of those factors influence whether someone identifies as a researcher or not. And that requires actually collecting that interview data, carefully reviewing the interview transcripts over and over again with multiple researchers so you can mitigate bias and sort of come to consensus on what you're really seeing in what people are telling you. And that helps us develop sort of a working model of what's going on that we can then test in a more statistical way with a large quantitative study.
You know, that's interesting because when we assess and evaluate applicants to our graduate programs, questions always come up about their research. And I think most of us are looking for them to be involved and not just telling us, well, I did this many PCRs and I ran them on a gel. We want to hear them explain the background, why they did it, you know, and maybe struggles they had and how they fixed that. And so I think that speaks to kind of ownership. And it sounds like that's what you're measuring.
Absolutely. And what I want to point out is that's an important thing for a student to embrace, but it's also an important thing for a mentor to attend to. So if they have a mentor who doesn't give them the space to take some ownership or says, no, that's the wrong thing to do, you're going to do this thing that I say. And I get it, right? I mean, we have more expertise, we have more experience, we can probably see a little bit farther in the future. But we want to also be really mindful of not always limiting students' intellectual responsibility or their opportunities to develop a sense of ownership of their work. So it's really a negotiation where you give students freedom to make some of those decisions and to take some intellectual responsibility while also providing support as a mentor so that they're not heading off just in unpredictable directions or unproductive directions that actually don't help us move forward in our research.
Yeah, I think that's really important to think about for the new faculty member because they are the ones that are transitioning right from that postdoc where they were the ones that were doing all the work, right? And they had their hands in everything. And now they're a mentor And to effectively be a good mentor, they have to let go. And I imagine that is just so difficult. I mean, do you see differences across the career? I mean, is that really true?
I will speak to my own personal experience because we haven't actually studied that sort of career development for faculty, but definitely when we're working with mentors to develop their mentoring skills, one of the hardest things is early career faculty, first of all, letting go and letting their students make some mistakes and knowing that it's going to be okay. And also realizing that they only have so much time in the day and they can't be the ones doing all the things if they actually want to make progress with their overall research agenda. Students need space to make mistakes and figure it out, but then support to navigate that. They also need you to realize that they don't have the expertise you have and to normalize that. So when you're a postdoc, you know you are at the top of your game in terms of your thinking about your research, your methodology, your ability to execute. And I would argue that that makes it really hard to remember what it's like to not be able to do that. It's called expert blind spot, where we lose track of the fact that, oh yeah, when I was a first-year grad student, I couldn't do that either.
So should we jump back a bit and not delay mentoring training until people are assistant professor, but start when they're postdocs or even graduate students?
That's a good question. I think that what's challenging is that we can do training, but until you're facing the situation, it's actually quite hard to think about how I'm going to transfer this thing I'm learning in a workshop, for example, or a seminar series to my actual day-to-day practice. And so one of the things that we're trying to do with actually another study that we have is to help mentors build skills as they are encountering the situation. So they have an opportunity to apply what they are learning as they are engaged in mentoring. And that first of all, gives them additional practice. They're more likely to learn. But it also creates a community that they can tap for advice when they face situations that they wouldn't have anticipated, for example, when they're in a couple of hour-long workshop.
Okay, so I think as our final question, I'm going to pose this to all three of us, actually. So what are some memories you have from your previous mentors that you think, looking back, positively impacted your career or your desire to go into research?
So I'm going to call out Lily and Evie again. The fact that she was willing to respond to that cold email and offer her expertise and support was pivotal for me. And so what I try to do as a faculty member now, although sometimes it can be overwhelming, we all have to practice saying no to all the asks that we get, is to try to be willing to respond to that cold email and provide support when I feel like someone really needs it.
For me, I think it started as an undergrad. I was doing undergrad research in the lab of Erwin Siegel at the University of California, Davis in the biochemistry department. And it was kind of a hands-off approach, but a shielded hands-off approach. And so he actually trusted a couple postdocs in his lab to do a good part of the mentoring. But they trusted me to do things. And I think they gave me, enough space that I could make progress and occasional lapses of progress and mistakes. But that's when I decided I love science. I got to try this stuff and I got to come up with ideas and run it past them. And that's what cemented science for me.
I'm going to end with two. The first is not a scientific mentor, but we said that mentors come in all shapes and forms. So I'm going to say my first mentor was my mom. So I think part of it was the fact that she was not a scientist or interested in science, but every time I went to her and asked her a question about science, she would always tell me to go look it up, right? So, that was the space to kind of explore and learn things on my own, which I think is really important. The second is my PhD mentor, Dr. Mark Monestier, and he was great because he let us as more senior graduate students start to mentor some of the younger graduate students in the lab. And that was kind of all-encompassing, not just on the day-to-day, but actually helping them learn how to write and things like that. And I can remember one specific time I was reviewing a younger graduate student's writing piece, and I went into Mark and I said, I don't know how you didn't have like red marks all over my paper if I was like the same student. And he said, Kim, that's not the way you do it. When you're mentoring someone and you're teaching someone how to write, you just focus on one section and then you give them your comments back and then have them look at that, read your comments, think about them, and then hopefully they will go and take that newfound knowledge or advice and apply it, start to work on the rest of the document, right? So you're not overwhelming them with criticism, but giving them just enough to go and kind of make it work on their own. So I thought that was great. So our guest today is Dr. Erin Dolan, professor in the Department of Biochemistry and Molecular Biology. Erin, thanks for being with us.
Thanks so much for the opportunity.
Links to additional information about Dr. Dolan's research can be found on our Instagram account at PPPPodcastUGA.
As always, we appreciate you tuning in today. And if this is your first time listening to People, Parasites, and Plagues, we encourage you to check out the other exciting episodes launched last season. Please rate the podcast, and if you have any questions or suggestions for future episodes, reach out to us via email at ppp@uga.edu. This broadcast is brought to you by the Faculty of Infectious Diseases and the Grady College of Journalism at the University of Georgia. It is supported by the University of Georgia through the Office of Research, the UGA Graduate School, and the College of Veterinary Medicine. Thanks to the New Media Institute at Grady for use of their Studio Not Found podcast facilities, and special thanks to our production assistant, Sid Wiggin, for research, editing, and scheduling.